This segment focuses on the spending multiplier. Spending creates more spending. If you spend $10 in your community, it is going to create more than $10 of total spending because that merchant will have money then to pay for things like raw materials, the heat bill, and things like that. We really see the ripple effect. In fact, there's a statement, and it's really encouraged quite a bit to shop locally because for every dollar you spend in your community, $7 ends up being created. That was the last study that I saw. But the whole idea is, what we're trying to figure out here is how much should the government increase spending by if it wants to increase aggregate expenditures to the point that we see full employment. If the government increases its spending by a certain amount, total spending, aggregate expenditures, is going to increase by more than that amount. And increased government spending leads to more employment, which leads to more consumption, consumer spending, and business investment. And we know that it is multiplied. An increase in government spending leads to a greater increase in aggregate expenditures, but then when the government decreases spending, we know that that leads to a greater decrease in aggregate expenditures too. This is why when there's communities that have are largely dependent on military contracts, they get really nervous when we start talking about cutbacks to the defense budget. The community that houses the company that makes Tomahawk cruise missiles, if the dollar amount the government is going to spend on those drops, well, it's going to have an impact on a greater number of people than just the corporation that produces them, right? It's going to be all of the employees, and then where do they spend their money, and where do they pay their taxes and the like. So it has a multiplied effect when it's increased or decreased. The spending multiplier is the tool we're going to use to identify at what rate spending is actually multiplied. But we do have to take the MPC into consideration. This, as you remember, is the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume is the inclination to consume additional dollars of income. If my income goes up by, we'll just say $10,000, I'm not going to consume the entire $10,000. I will save a portion of it as well. So the spending multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. Now, you guys are probably thinking 1 minus the MPC, that is equal to the MPS. And that's exactly correct. So I think it's just a little bit easier to look at the spending multiplier as 1 divided by the MPS because it's really the very same thing. Just to illustrate that again, the spending multiplier is also equal to 1 divided by the MPS, since 1.0 minus the MPC is equal to the MPS. MPS and MPC always have to equal 1.0. Let's go ahead and just apply the spending multiplier a bit so you can see how it works. The spending multiplier, if the government increases government spending by 0.5 and the MPC is 0.5, or excuse me, if the government spending increases by 0.5 trillion and the MPC is 0.5, we determine that the spending multiplier is 2.0. How did we get that? We took 1 and divided it by the MPS. The MPS is 1 minus the MPC, or 0.5, so we get 1 divided by 0.5, and that gives us 2 times. That means for each additional dollar of spending by the government, total spending increases by 2 times that amount. So if the government increases spending by 0.5 trillion, aggregate expenditures is not going to increase by 0.5 trillion, but 2 times 0.5 trillion. We're going to take the increase in government spending, that's the equation we're going to be taking a look at, the change in government spending, and as you recall from a previous unit, this delta symbol means change. So the change in government spending times the spending multiplier gives us the total change in aggregate expenditures. In this particular case, government spending increased by 0.5 trillion. The multiplier is 2.0, so aggregate expenditures increases by $1 trillion in total. Now we can use this same thing to solve for the change in government spending. If we know that in order to be at full employment, aggregate expenditures needs to increase by 1 trillion, and we know that the spending multiplier is 2, we can very easily solve for the change in government spending necessary to accommodate this. All we need to do is divide both sides by 2. And we get 0.5 trillion over here. And we see the change in government spending necessary to achieve that $1 trillion increase in expenditures is 0.5 trillion. Okay? So looking at some notes, just going over this, we'll just review that. If we know that aggregate expenditures needs to increase by $1 trillion, we can divide that by the spending multiplier to get the required increase in government spending to accommodate it. Again, we took the $1 trillion, divided it by the spending multiplier, and got 0.5 trillion necessary increase in government spending. That's referred to as an injection, a government injection, or an economic injection. Now, Keynes argued that an increase in government spending, again, the warning is here, when the economy is operating at a level below full employment, would increase aggregate expenditures. That leads to an increase in aggregate output, Y, our GDP from a previous unit, and an increase in employment, as the increase in aggregate expenditures caused inventory levels to be depleted. When inventory levels are going down, that's when producers really ramp up production because they need to accommodate that increase in demand. So let's look at some examples. Let's assume, as we know, the spending multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the MPS. Government spending increases by $200 billion, and the MPS is 0.3. We know automatically then that the MPC must be 0.7, don't we? The spending multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the MPS, and when we divide that out, we get a spending multiplier of 3.3 times. So the spending multiplier is 3.3 times. Government increased its spending by $200 million. Aggregate expenditures is going to increase not by $200 billion, but by 200 times 3.3 times. So how much does aggregate expenditures increase by? Here is our change in government spending. We multiply it by the spending multiplier, and we see that aggregate expenditures increases by $666 billion. Not the $200 billion. Because of the multiplier effect, it's going to increase by 3.3 times the size of that injection. Let's look at another one. We'll assume that government expenditures increase by $200 billion, and the MPC is 0.8. Well, if the MPC is 0.8, we know that the MPS must be 0.2 because they always together have to equal 1.0. The spending multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 0.2, or 5 times. How much does aggregate expenditures increase by then? In other words, C plus I plus G plus X equals aggregate expenditures. How much is that total spending going to increase by? Well, government expenditures increased by $200 billion. The multiplier is 5, so we would take 200 times 5 and get, 1,000 billion, which is the very same thing as 1 trillion. Note that the MPC had a significant impact on the spending multiplier. In the previous case, government spending increased by $200 billion. Well, that's exactly what it increased by in this scenario, but what changed was the multiplier. Here, the MPC was 0.8. The MPC on our previous one was different. The MPC was 0.7 because the MPS was 0.3. We'll look at a couple other examples here. If the government has determined that aggregate expenditures needs to increase by $900 trillion, and the spending multiplier is 3.3, the question is, how much does government spending need to increase by to accommodate that, to facilitate it? So here's where we're just looking at the same equation but solving for something different. Remember, we said that a change in government spending times the spending multiplier is going to give us the change in aggregate expenditures. We said if we know what this is, and we know what the spending multiplier is, we can certainly solve for what is the injection necessary to accommodate that. All we had to do was divide both sides by the spending multiplier. And that's exactly what happened here. We determined, or the government determined, that in order to get us at full employment, aggregate expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X, needs to increase by $900 trillion. We're going to take that $900 trillion, we divide it by the spending multiplier, which is 3.3, and we get $272.7 trillion. So the point is this. The government does not need to increase its spending by $900 trillion in order to get aggregate expenditures to increase by $900 trillion. How much does government need to increase its spending by? $272.7 trillion. We'll do another one. If the government has determined that aggregate expenditures needs to increase by $500 billion and the spending multiplier is 2.0, how much does the government need to inject into the economy? Again, we solve in the same way. In order to get aggregate expenditures up by $500 billion, the government does not need to spend $500 billion. We're going to take that $500 billion divided by the spending multiplier, and we get $2.5 billion. So an injection of $2.5 billion will create an increase in aggregate expenditure of $500 billion. Now, there's some discussion about recessionary gaps in your book, and I just want to talk about that a little bit. A recessionary gap, you know, a recession, remember, is when the GDP decreases 3 consecutive quarters. Some economists say it's 2 quarters that we see a decrease in consecutively, plus a few other things, but let's just stick with 3 right now. A recessionary gap is the amount by which aggregate expenditures must be increased by to achieve full employment equilibrium. To correct the economy, the government has some options, and this is what we call fiscal policy. When the government makes corrections to, fix or stabilize our economy, we call it fiscal policy. They can either increase government expenditures like we've been talking about, or they can decrease taxes. Let's go ahead and look at the first tool, increase government spending. We're going to assume that full employment GDP is $6 trillion. But the current level of the gross domestic product is $4 trillion. So we have a recessionary gap of $2 trillion. The spending multiplier is 2.0. How can the gap be filled? If government spending increases by $1 trillion, aggregate expenditures will increase by $2 trillion because of that spending multiplier of 2.0. Remember, $1 trillion injection, government spending of $1 trillion times the multiplier of 2 gives us an increase in aggregate expenditures of $2 trillion. That can be accomplished through a lot of different things, such as road constructions, military, you name it. Now, what if the government says, well, instead of increasing government spending, we're going to decrease taxes? So let's see how they're going to do that. Now, it's not going to work the same way, because we have to consider the fact that we have to take the MPC into consideration. If the government decreases tax rates, consumers will have more money to spend. Yay, that's wonderful. However, if their disposable income goes up, are they going to consume all of it? No, they're going to save some of it. So we have to take that marginal propensity to consume into consideration. Let's assume we have a recessionary gap of $500 million. If the government decreases taxes by $500, aggregate expenditures does not increase by that amount because consumers generally do not spend all of that additional income. They also save. If the MPC is 0.5, that means this additional $500 I get in disposable income because my taxes went down. I'm not going to spend or consume the whole $500. What am I going to consume? If the MPC is 0.5, well, I'll increase my consumption by $250, but I'm going to save the remaining portion. Here's where we're going to modify our tools for multiplication a little bit. Okay? We're going to look at the tax multiplier, or the TM. So how much do taxes have to decrease by to fill or to increase aggregate expenditures by 500, the amount needed to bring the economy to full employment? We're going to use the tax multiplier. The tax multiplier is equal to 1 minus the spending multiplier. We're going to take the change in taxes times the tax multiplier, and that will give us the change in aggregate expenditures. Let's look at a few examples. If the spending multiplier is 4, well, we know how to calculate the tax multiplier. We said the tax multiplier is equal to 1 minus the spending multiplier. In other words, 1 minus 4 gives us -3. The change in taxes times that tax multiplier gives us the change in aggregate expenditures. If taxes decrease by $400, I will take that negative 400, a decline in taxes, I'm going to multiply it by minus 3, which is the tax multiplier, and I'm going to get a positive $1,200. So a $400 decrease in taxes times the tax multiplier, it's a negative 3, so a negative times a negative is a positive. We're going to see aggregate expenditures increase by $1,200. A decline in taxes of 400 would increase aggregate expenditures by $1,200. Let's modify our example a little bit. Again, we're going to assume that the spending multiplier is 4. Now let's assume that aggregate expenditures must increase by $500 in order to bring the nation to full employment. In other words, to get us to full employment, we need the total C plus I plus G plus X to increase by 500. Spending multiplier is 4, therefore the tax multiplier is minus 3. 1 minus the spending multiplier gives us minus 3. The change in taxes necessary to accommodate this $500 increase in aggregate expenditures is what we're solving for. Change in taxes times the tax multiplier of minus 3. We need to figure out what that is to get the $500 increase in aggregate expenditures. All we need to do is divide both sides by minus 3, and we can get that. We'll get the change in taxes on the one side of the equation by taking 500 and dividing it by the negative 3. So we get 500 divided by negative 3 gives us the changes in taxes necessary. So if taxes went down by $166.6, in other words, $166.60, we would see aggregate expenditures increase by 500. So you can see that, again, the tools of fiscal policy, there were 2 of them. One was increasing government spending. We looked at that a whole lot. Another tool, though, is a decrease in taxes. We're going to get different answers. We can't say an increase in government spending of 500 is going to have the same impact that a decrease in taxes of 500 is going to have, because we have to consider that marginal propensity to consume has a great impact on consumption function, which has a great impact on aggregate expenditures.